3 lines down, after the politicians I went to the poets, those of the tragedies and dithyrambs and the others. He doesn't mention comedy in particular, which I think is interesting. It could be included in the others, but he doesn't mention it in particular. And he says that none of these poets were wise, that none of them could give an account of what they were doing. But I think it's so interesting that he leaves out comedy, because it leaves open the possibility that not all comic poets are so foolish. And that leaves open the possibility that Aristophanes. And he talks about the manual artisans, and he says, well, the manual artisans really do know something. They know their art. But the trouble is they think that their art, their expertise in one area, makes them wise about all things. And he claims that they have a wisdom understood as art. But he disavows having any kind of wisdom understood as an art. And I really think that this is very important. In many of the dialogues, Socrates is going around talking about wisdom on the analogy of certain arts. But as soon as you recognize that wisdom isn't on the same level as the other arts, because it's precisely wisdom you need to apply an art rightly, then the art analogy breaks down. And Socrates' understanding of wisdom is not as a kind of art, which I think is extremely important. But he, again, denies wisdom understood as art here, but he doesn't deny having another kind of wisdom, which is important. On the way to class, he passed by this flyer, and the flyer had a big word, edutainment, on it. And it was advertising a rapper named KRS-One and Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys, who were coming to talk about freedom of speech. And he pulled down the poster and he took it into his class and he held it up and said, these are the kinds of people Socrates would be questioning today, because here are these people who are artists. You know, let's be broad-minded in our definition of art, who claim to be able, on the basis of their art, to be speaking of things that are really not art things anymore, but they're things of broader cultural significance. It's like Jane Fonda, who played a farmer's wife in a movie, going to Congress to testify on the plight of farm families, or Meryl Streep, who was in a movie about nuclear meltdowns, going to testify on nuclear things. As long as you forget the distinction between fantasy and reality, they become experts. In America, we're especially easily bamboozled by the art of acting, or the art of pretending. Who in their right mind would think that somebody whose entire life is a matter of pretending to be something that they're not is an expert on the things that they're pretending to be? You know, and Socrates, there's a dialogue called the Eon, or Ion, where he questions basically an actor. It's a rhapsode, a person who makes his living by reciting Homer and acting it out. And this guy claims to be wise, but when Socrates says, when you talk about chariots in Homer, are you wiser than a charioteer? Well, no. Well, when you talk about generalship, does that make you wiser than a general? No. And he mercilessly goes through and shows that this guy, who doesn't have any real wisdom at all, that he has the quality of pretending to be wise. This is like Whoopi Goldberg, right? She was so wonderful at pretending to be a sage on Star Trek: The Next Generation. You know, you go and talk to her and she could give advice. But in real life, she seems to be this sort of a twit. And there's something remarkable about the art of acting, that even somebody who's conspicuously silly can seem to be wise. Socrates was very disturbed by the capacities like this, and this would fall under the artists that he questioned. Well, Socrates' argument is precisely this. Rhapsodes, actors, so forth, and poets can give the appearance of wisdom through inspiration. They're divinely inspired. They act through divine inspiration. They don't act through art. They're masters of appearances because they're inspired to create appearances. They don't have knowledge of the things that they do. There's something disturbing about people who have such a mastery of appearances, because you feel that anybody who has such a mastery of appearance might not necessarily be concerned about substance. And this is what concerns Socrates about art in general, that there's a mastery over appearance that doesn't necessarily have any correlation with substance. And therefore he was concerned with the moral status of art, or any kind of imitative faculty. And there is some truth to that. It's not to say that all artists are bad, but it is to say that there are certain alluring forms of corruption that go along with appearance. Art is a powerful technique, right? And just like any kind of technique, it can be used for good or evil ends. And therefore it needs an additional supplement of wisdom to guide it. And what was going on at the time is Socrates was giving primarily a critique of autonomous art. Autonomous in the sense that it gave its own law to itself. Are the artists, the notion of poets as legislators. And he was really saying, well, no, there's something deeply troubling about this, because with all this technique and all this mastery of seeming, there's not any necessary connection with the good in art. And so what art needs to justify itself is what everything else needs to justify itself, really. It needs moral guidance. It needs wisdom. And so what you get, the paradigms of art for Plato, are really the dialogues themselves, which are great works of art. And they're an interesting melange of all the different artistic genres that existed at the time, yet they're infused with an orientation towards what's good. Whereas he looked at many artists at the time who were preaching tyranny and all kinds of other things, glamorizing evil, like artists do today. You need to be morally critical of art. And I think that for Plato, a paradigm of great art would be something like Dante, which is, in a sense, art that administrative to some higher notion of what's good, rather than an art that says, well, it's autonomous and it legislates for itself what's good. Because oftentimes with that kind of art, you find the glamorization of evil, and you find people who pass that off as, well, an unimpeachable activity because of artistic integrity or something. And he's very much opposed to that. That's what makes him nervous about art. If you understand art as some kind of technique of bringing about a transformation of the world, because every art, properly understood by the Greeks, gives you power over contraries, as they understood it. Meaning that, for instance, if you are a doctor, it gives you the power to cure or to kill. The same techniques, the same actions can do both. And there's a kind of frightening moral neutrality about any technique. It's not necessarily good, just in and of itself. Autonomous technique is not connected with goodness. The power of public speaking can be used to delude people or to give people the truth. And the same with the power of art. The power of art can be used to delude people, to glamorize evil, or to enlighten people and to orient the soul towards what's good. But in and of itself, the art is not pinned down morally one way or another. No art is, no technique is. And that's why you need wisdom. And therefore wisdom is different in kind, because it's always directed towards the good. By its very nature, it's not a technique that's morally neutral. It's the very opposite of moral neutrality, and it's the thing that's the great substitute for moral neutrality. And so it's a supplement that the arts need in order to be oriented towards doing good things. And if you look at what professions are a combination of technique and a moral orientation. Every profession has its code of ethics. Doctors, lawyers, architects, and so forth. And this is in part what makes the professions have a certain dignity and status above mere techniques, because they recognize the great power of their techniques to do ill, and therefore they're never taught without fusing them with a kind of moral code. So you've got the Hippocratic Oath, for instance, that guides doctors. This is why the whole assisted suicide debate, I think, is so dangerous. Because on the surface it looks like it's an attempt just to add another thing to the physician's bag of tricks. But really what it does is it transforms medicine from a profession understood as having a preset ethical goal, namely to do no harm, be a sort of zealous advocate for the patient's continued existence, to a morally neutral activity that dispenses death or cures according to what's imperatives, well, the conscience, I guess, of the doctor, but more often it's going to be the imperatives of the insurance adjusters, hospital administrators, and the state, right? And that's not a small transformation, that's a total revolution. Page 72, near the center, where a little above the center, he talks about how, in addition to these things, the young who follow me of their own accord, those who have the most leisure, the sons of the wealthiest, enjoy hearing human beings examined. Of course they do, because it's comical to see people's pretensions punctured. And they themselves often imitate me, and in turn they attempt to examine others. Well, this is teaching by example, right? At the bottom of the page, he talks about how Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, his three accusers, represent three groups that he's punctured in their pretensions of wisdom. The artisans, the politicians, and the playwrights, or the poets, I should say. And then at the very last line he says, "This is the truth for you, men of Athens. I am hiding nothing from you, either great or small, in my speech, nor am I holding anything back." Again, by saying that he's holding back nothing great or small, or hiding nothing great or small, that doesn't mean he's not hiding things that fall between the great and small. And it's artfully placed there, which leaves open the possibility that there is a certain amount of concealment going on here. And this is important to recognize because we see that he's actually concealing things. Then he takes up the attack of the new accusers on the top of 73. And basically what he does is he first cross-examines Miletus about the claim that Socrates corrupts the youth. And basically he says, well, who does the youth good? And Miletus' answer is the laws, and then everybody in Athens seems to do the youth good except for Socrates. And Socrates just sort of laughs that off, right, and says, well, that's preposterous, that everybody else does the youth good except for me. Well, but that doesn't really refute the charge that Socrates corrupts the youth. What he's done is he's got to make an extremely absurd claim that everybody benefits them and then laughs at that. But he hasn't refuted the claim that he corrupts the youth. So then he goes on to, on page 75, he adds something to his attack on this. He says, you know, Miletus, you're so smart, whereas I, at my great age, am so ignorant that apparently you think that I am not even cognizant that if I ever do something wretched to any of my associates, I will risk getting back something bad from him. Do you think I'm so naive as to think that I could corrupt the sons of my neighbors and not expect anything bad to happen to me? Well, you know, the thing is that there are people that naive, and one of them is Socrates in the clouds, right? Surely I'm not that naive, but surely he could be. But then the next thing he does is he goes on to the issue of whether Socrates brings in new gods and disbelieves in the old gods. And the first thing he does is he gets Miletus to formulate his disbelief in the gods of the city as a disbelief in any gods at all. And then as soon as he does that, he says, well, Miletus, you also assert that I believe in a daimonion, right? Yes. Well, can you ever have daimonions without daimonia? Aren't daimonia the offspring of gods, right? It would be like believing in mules without believing in horses and asses, right? Because mules are the offspring of horses and asses, just as daimonia are the offspring of gods and mortals. And if I believe in daimonia, then I must believe in gods. But notice that doesn't establish that he believes in the gods of Athens. And that's really the charge. He doesn't believe in the gods of the city. But by getting Miletus to change the charge into he doesn't believe in any kind of gods, he then can show that he's inconsistent when he says that he brings in new gods. Because how can you bring in new gods if you don't believe in any? But he hasn't actually refuted the claim, or even dealt with the claim that he disbelieves in the gods of the city. Because you can believe that his daimonion is an offspring of a different god. It gives the impression of disputing and refuting, but doesn't actually accomplish that. And it's such a systematic pattern throughout the apology that you start thinking, well, this is a systematic pattern for a reason. What Plato's trying to do here is he's trying to show us the political predicament of philosophy and what position philosophy is forced into if it's ever hauled up before the bar and forced to justify itself publicly. It can't truthfully justify itself. Or it can't justify itself by telling the truth. And so it's forced systematically to be deceptive. And this is interesting, and another thing we can raise here is this. We can raise the question, what is Socrates defending in his apology? When the title is Apology of Socrates, but the of here is ambiguous in English just as the genitive is in Greek. Is it the apology, is it Socrates' apology for Socrates? Or is it Socrates' apology for something else? The question is, does Socrates end up defending himself here? If he's defending himself, he's doing a pretty lousy job. Because although he refutes the charges and he attacks the charges, he does so in such a way that guarantees to anger his judges to the point where they convict him and they condemn him. For instance, before he's convicted, he talks about why he never got involved in politics. And he says to the audience, if I got involved with you, you do injustice. He says, the people, the demos, do injustice. And if I were to oppose you, because I'm a good man, then you would destroy me. Well, what does that imply about the audience? Well, they're bad men. He's pointing to the audience and saying, you are bad men, and if I ever got involved with you, you'd destroy me because I'd have to oppose you at every turn because you do injustice. That's not designed to ingratiate yourself. and he says this near the end of the speech before they're going to vote. And then after they vote to convict him, he says, I propose that as a counter penalty to death, you give me free meals at public expense, which is an outrageous thing, designed to do nothing more than get them angry at him. And so Socrates' behavior in here indicates whatever he's defending. He's not defending himself, because if he's defending himself, then he's not a very clever speaker, but we know that he's a very clever speaker. So what's he defending in the defense? I mean, what is he defending here? He's defending philosophy. But he's also defending philosophy in such a way that it shows you the difficulties of defending philosophy in a public context. But he does get out what the real defense of philosophy is after he's been convicted, and that is, namely, that without it, life isn't worth living. That without wisdom, we're lost. That none of the good things in life are necessarily good for us unless we have the wisdom to use them properly. And therefore, no matter what faith you have, if you're in fortunate circumstances, if you have all the things that, all the benefits that life may have to offer, if you don't have the wisdom to use them properly, you're just screwed. And so, in that sense, life isn't worth living without wisdom, because you're really just at the mercy of fortune. The best you can hope for is to luck out, to be in a fool's paradise if you don't have wisdom. But most people are not in fool's paradises. And most unwise people end up suffering more than they otherwise need to. And some of them are better off dead, perhaps. Socrates is pretty harsh on that point. But he does think that people are better off dead than fools. He's serious about this enough to accept this himself, because to claim that you're better off being dead than being a fool is, as he understands wisdom, to be equivalent to the claim that you're better off dead than being vicious. Because virtue is identical to wisdom for him. Virtue is practical wisdom. And he himself says that he'd prefer to be dead than vicious. And this is why he says that he will not do any harm to any others, even though they might be trying to do harm to him. The reason being that he's better off dead as a victim of injustice than to live on at the expense of doing injustice, because doing injustice is going to corrupt his soul and make him into a bad person. Whereas no matter what your enemies do to you, they can't make you into a bad human being. They can't corrupt your soul. They can kill you, but they can't make you into a monster. And he's serious enough about that he's willing to die rather than to do certain things. And this is one of the things that's so impressive about Socrates later on in the Apology. You know, he's constantly saying, look, there are things worse than death, namely villainy.
That's why he's defending philosophy, because without it, it's not worth living.
It's not like he's sacrificing himself for the sake of philosophy. Well, he's sacrificing his life for the sake of his soul, in a sense. He's willing to die because he's not willing to live under just any old conditions. He's not willing to live in a condition where his soul is corrupted or where he has to compromise himself. Now, note that he's willing to compromise, in a sense, by not fully speaking the truth. But in the Republic, there's a distinction made between two kinds of lies. One is a lie you tell somebody else, and the other is a lie you tell yourself. And whatever Socrates is willing to do, he's not willing to lie to himself or deceive himself. The lie of the soul is the most hateful thing, he says. And he's willing to deceive others, but he's not willing to corrupt his own soul. And he also believes that deception can be used as a tool for the helping of other people. So he doesn't necessarily believe that by deceiving people, he's corrupting their souls. And notice how he deals with Euthyphro. Using false premises. He's asserting false premises. Euthyphro, if you can't define piety, you don't know what it is. Well, that's really not literally true. But Euthyphro believes it, and Euthyphro's better by being wrestled into submission, having accepted this false premise. He ends up a better man. And Socrates thinks that it's quite often the case that you can inoculate people against doing bad things by deceiving them in the proper way. So he doesn't think that he's corrupting others by deceiving them. He's not willing to engage in activities that corrupt himself or others, and he'd rather die than be forced to do that. He says that near the end of his initial speech, he says, I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to beg. I'm not going to bring my family out here. And I'm not going to tell you the things that you want to hear. Why? Because the person who tells you what you want to hear, rather than what's good for you to hear, is a flatterer, not a friend. And flatterers are corrupters. And in the Gorgias, he gives this beautiful example of, or beautiful analogy of how a wise man who practices the true political art and tells people the truth and tries to help their souls, help them, exhort them to care for their souls, in the democracy that he lives in, if he got on trial, if he were put on trial, would be in the same situation as a doctor would be if he's brought up before a jury of children and his accuser is a pastry chef. The pastry chef says, I give you things that are good to eat, and he gives you painful shots and yucky potions and things like that. And of course, the doctor is not going to be able to acquit himself because he hasn't flattered the taste of these children and corrupted them. He's been bettering them, but they don't like it. Whereas the pastry chef feeds them all kinds of delicious things that are making them ill. And this is the situation that Socrates is in right now. He's the doctor accused before the jury of children by the pastry chefs of Athens, the people who make flattering mind candy that corrupts the people. And he's not going to engage in that activity of corrupting by pandering to them or flattering their needs by begging or things like that, by bringing his children forward. In the Wasps, there's a parody of this where the dog is being accused of eating the cheese, and she brings her puppies in, to whine and wail, so she's acquitted. The old father, once he's forced to stay home from the law courts, turns his whole house into a law court, puts the dog on trial for stealing cheese. It's quite comical.
If the judges are truly wise, though, that wouldn't matter anyway. If they were flattered, or the kids and the family there, it truly wouldn't matter.
Yeah, and he says that real judges judge on the basis of what's right, not on the basis of what flatters them. But of course, they don't have real judges here. Professional juries is a bad thing, but professional judges is a very good thing. Part of what you hope happens when a person becomes a judge is there's a sign that they have a certain amount of knowledge of the law, but also a certain amount of equity, a certain amount of wisdom in how to apply the law rightly, to keep their eye on what's right. And those people you can have a better chance of appealing to oftentimes than even a jury. So anyway, Socrates has, quote-unquote, refuted the new accusers in a very slippery fashion, as we've become accustomed to seeing now. And so he talks about, well, aren't you afraid of death, bottom of 78. Perhaps then someone might say, then are you not ashamed, Socrates, of having followed the sort of pursuit from which you now run the risk of dying? I would respond to him with a just speech. What you say is ignoble, fellow, if you suppose that a man who has even a little benefit should take into account the danger of living or dying, but not rather consider this alone whenever he acts, whether his actions are just or unjust, and the deeds of a good man or a bad. For according to your speech, those of the demigods who met their death at their end at Troy would be paltry, especially the son of Thetis, namely Achilles, who constantly risked death over honor, right? The fact of the matter is that what's genuinely heroic is a human being who's willing to put their own physical survival at risk for what they consider to be right or just. And this is Socrates' ethic, too. And so he's saying, I'm just as heroic as Achilles. And it's ignoble for people to be too concerned about saving their own butts. But again, Athens by this time has been thoroughly corrupt, part by its politicians. It's the demagogues like Pericles and so forth. He talks about this in the Gorgias, how they flattered the populace and corrupted them in many ways. At the bottom of 79, or at the center really, this is the way it is, men of Athens, in truth. Whenever someone stations himself holding that it is best, or whenever he is stationed by a ruler, there he must stay and run the risk, as it seems to me, and not take into account death or anything else compared to what is shameful. And then he talks about how when he was sent off to battle for Athens, he did his duty properly. He said, I stayed when they stationed me and ran the risk of dying like anyone else. But when the gods stationed me, as I supposed and assumed, ordering me to live philosophizing and examining myself and others, I had then left my station because I feared death or no matter whatever. And then he goes on and he makes some knowledge claims here, which are very interesting. And then he says, well, first of all, the people who fear death are really pretending to be wiser than they are, because they claim to know that death is a bad thing. Now, that's really not exactly true, because a person who fears death can simply fear the fact that they don't know what death holds for them, right? It's not necessarily that people who fear death fear it because they know that they're going to be roasted slowly on a spit for all eternity or something. But people fear death because it's an unknown. But Socrates apparently doesn't. And this is something very interesting about him. This is something interesting about his philosophical temperament. He's not afraid of the unknown. He's constantly searching for what's unknown. There's a nice opposition to this in the Republic when he talks about the guardians as philosophical dogs. They're watchdogs. That means they bark at strangers and are friendly to things that are close to them, which is very peculiar to call it philosophical. And the reason he calls them philosophical is not because their natures are philosophical, but because their natures are given to them by the philosophers who train them. But what's pointed out in that claim that, these dogs are philosophical is really the fact that philosophers aren't like watchdogs. They don't bark at things that are unfamiliar to them and nuzzle everything that's close. In fact, they tend to be hard on the things that are close to them, those things that are familiar, and to be constantly interested in things that are strange and unknown. There's a constant quest for, not necessarily the new, but the true, right? And sometimes what's true isn't very novel after all. Novelty is never an index of truth, so I wouldn't say they're necessarily innovative, but what they are is they're open to things that are strange and different. And they're open to things that are strange and different precisely because they recognize that the things close at hand are not entirely good. If you're totally satisfied with the things at hand, you don't look for anything new, which is like a watchdog, right? Dogs love their masters and bark at strangers, and philosophers don't necessarily love their masters and are not afraid of what's strange at all. In fact, they search it out. And Socrates, by implication, isn't afraid of death because it's an unknown. Maybe he's intensely curious about it precisely because it's unknown, which is unusual for human beings. But then he goes on, below where it says be in the margin on that page, he says, but I, men, am perhaps distinguished from the many human beings also here in this, and if I were to say that I am wiser than anyone in anything, it would be in this, that since I do not know sufficiently about the things in Hades, so also I suppose that I do not know. Since I do not know sufficiently, I suppose that I don't know, meaning that he knows that he doesn't know, okay? But I do know, he says. Here's a knowledge claim from Socrates. He's supposed to know nothing. But I do know that it is bad and shameful to do injustice and to disobey one's better, whether God or human being. So compared to the bad things which I know are bad, I will never fear or flee the things about which I do not know whether they even happen to be good. Okay, so he's saying, look, I know that being evil is bad, and I don't know that being dead is bad. And therefore, given the choice, well, I prefer to die, because death might be a profit. Whereas he knows that evil certainly isn't, which is a strong knowledge claim. And again, he talks about what his philosophical activity is on the next page. It's very nice. Second line on page 81. Someone says to him, Socrates, for now we will not obey Anytus, but we will let you go. We will let you go, but on this condition, that you no longer spend time in this investigation or philosophize, and if you are caught still doing this, you will die. Well, he's not going to accept that condition for getting off. He says, if you would let me go then, as I said, on these conditions, I would say to you, I, men of Athens, salute and love you, but I will obey the god rather than you. and as long as I breathe and am able to, I will certainly not stop philosophizing. And I will exhort you and explain this to whomever of you I happen to meet, and I will speak just the sorts of things I am accustomed to. Quote, best of men, you are an Athenian from the city that is greatest and best reputed for wisdom and strength. Are you not ashamed that you care for having as much money as possible, and reputation and honor, so that you neither care nor give thought to prudence and truth, and how your soul will be the best possible? This is his constant claim, You're putting money and reputation ahead of the quality of your own soul, which is not to say that money and reputation are bad, but simply that they're not the highest things to pursue, and certainly not things to pursue at the expense of your own moral corruption. Prudence means practical wisdom, right? Truth means, truth, and the care of the soul. These are the highest concerns that people should have. And if one of you disputes it and asserts that he does not care, I will not immediately let him go, nor will I go away, but I will speak to him and examine and test him. And if he does not seem to me to possess virtue, but only says he does, I will reproach him, saying that he regards the things worth the most as the least important, and the paltrier things as the more important. I will do this to whomever, younger or older, I happen to meet, both foreigner and townsman, but more so to the townsman, inasmuch as you are closer to me in kin, which I think is interesting. He does recognize a certain partiality to his own. He continues, and this is all very good. Know well, then, that the God orders this, and I suppose that until now no greater good has arisen for you in the city than my service to the God, God's gift, anything. For I go around to do nothing but persuade you, both younger and older, not to care for bodies and money before, nor as vehemently as how your soul will be the best possible. I say, not from money does virtue come, but from virtue comes money and all the other good things for human beings, both publicly and privately. Or privately and publicly. Now, that's a strange claim. All the other good things come from virtue. Virtue doesn't come from these good things. Well, that's a peculiar claim when you think of just how many people prosper out of vice, right? But what Socrates is going to say is they really aren't prospering. Because even though they might have all kinds of good things, the vicious activities that they have engaged in to get them have precisely led to their moral corruption. And their moral corruption means that they don't have the wisdom to use these things rightly to lead a happy life. And this is the sense in which the good things in life come from virtue, meaning that none of the things in life that are apparently good are going to be really good unless you've got the wisdom, the virtue to use them properly. And if you have all these good things at the cost of corrupting yourself, you're not going to be made happy by them. You might feel good a lot. But again, happiness for the Greeks does not mean well-feeling, but well-being. It means a state of harmony and health of the soul. It's possible to be in a state of pain physically and still have harmony and health of the soul. Okay, and it's possible to be in a state of pleasure physically and to be in a state of disharmony and mental or spiritual disease. And the question is, which is the most important? Well, if you could do it, you would have both, right? You'd be happy physically and you have well-being spiritually. But if you have to choose between, you choose the most important, which is the health soul. So that's the sense that he's saying that. Now, of course, the Athenians don't like to hear that, and they make a big fuss over it. At the top of 82, he says, if you kill me, this will hurt you more than it hurts. Why? Because, well, I'll be dead, but you'll be villains. You won't have harmed me spiritually. You'll just kill me, and I'm 70 years old. I'll be dead anyway soon. Yeah, and he'll die well, yeah. Whereas they'll become villains, and they'll think that they have gained something, but they'll have really lost something. They'll have just made themselves worse men. And in the center of the page, he brings in this famous metaphor of the gadfly that illustrates his activity. So I, men of Athens, am now far from making a defense speech on my own behalf, as someone might suppose. I do it rather on your behalf, so that you do not do something wrong concerning the gift of the God to you by voting to condemn me. For if you kill me, you will not easily discover another of my sort, who, even if it is rather ridiculous to say, has simply been set upon the city by the God as though upon a great and well-born horse, who is rather sluggish because of his great size and needs to be awakened by some gadfly. Just so, in fact, the God seems to me to have set me upon the city as someone of this sort, I awaken and persuade and reproach each one of you, and I do not stop settling down everywhere upon you the whole day. Someone else of this sort will certainly not easily arise for you men. Well, if you obey me, you will spare me, but perhaps you will be vexed like the drowsy when they are awakened, and if you obey Anytus and slap me, you would easily kill me. Then you would spend the rest of your lives asleep unless the God sends you someone else in his concern for you. I think that's beautiful. Then he talks about how, again, he stayed out of politics. And he accuses people at the top of 83, first paragraph there. It might seem to be strange that I do go around counseling these things and being a busybody in private, but that in public I do not dare to go up before your multitude to counsel the city. And he says that the daimonion began for him in childhood and always counseled him against this. But I don't think it began in childhood. But again, what he's doing is he's defending his whole life. He's not doing a yes-but kind of defense. He's not saying there was Socrates 1 and Socrates 2. That's a way of understanding it, because, and that would actually make sense with the notion that we all have a capacity, a moral sensibility, but it's a capacity to, what we learn is to listen to it or not to listen to it. And that really is a necessary assumption if you're going to say that bad people are blameworthy. Because, in a sense, you can only say that somebody is blameworthy if they knew better than what they did. And Socrates, of course, makes the claim that the deepest desire of every human being is to do what's good. And that's, in some sense, equivalent to saying we've already got some intrinsic moral sense, and that it's only through ignorance that we do bad.
That's another called bestiality.
Well, bestiality is something different, because that would be a person who's never developed any moral sensibility at all. Aristotle, modifies Socrates' view a little bit, and I think it makes it better, because he makes it, Socrates argues that if you know what's good, you do it. And Aristotle says, well, it's all too often the case that you know what's good and don't do it. So how do you explain this fact? And his account of that actually ends up being, in some subtle way, consistent with Socrates, because he says it's possible for human beings, because of their passions, to, in a sense, not know, because they put out of their mind what they do know, and therefore they do wrong, even though they always know better, in some sense. So anyway, he accuses the people. He says, where it says he in the margin, now do not be vexed with me when I speak the truth, for there is no human being who will preserve his life if he genuinely opposes either you or any other multitude and prevents many unjust and unlawful things from happening in the city. Rather, if someone who really fights for the just is going to preserve himself even for a short time, it is necessary for him to lead a private rather than a public life. And the life of philosophy is always an essentially private life, because it recognizes that there are not many philosophers. There are more of them than there are of us. We're not going to persuade them all, and they tend to get irritated when people go against their cherished falsehoods and illusions. And therefore, philosophers who go around with sandwich boards declaring that the world is corrupt end up being swatted sooner than poor Socrates. The loose shingles get nailed down, and therefore, if you're going to lead a life pursuing wisdom and the care of the soul, you have to do it privately. But that doesn't mean that you ignore everybody around you, but it does mean that the benefits that you do to others are on a personal basis, on a face-to-face, rather than on a political basis. Socrates always dealt with individuals. He didn't stand before the multitude and harangue them or sermonize. You can't really accommodate your speeches very well to a mass of people, because they're all different types. You can only really benefit a person if you do it face-to-face. Well, one of the ways that he denies the claim that he's corrupted the youth is said, okay, if any of you have been corrupted by me, raise your hand. Well, even if they had been corrupted, they're certainly not going to do that, and he takes the absence of anybody as proof that he hasn't done any harm, which is just an extraordinary bit of faith on his part. There are just a couple other things here. One last thing. Very bottom of 93, third line from the bottom. This is after he's been condemned. I affirm, you men who condemn me to death, that vengeance will come upon you right after my death, and much harsher, by Zeus, than the sort you give me by killing me. For you have now done this deed, supposing that you will be released from giving an account of your life. But it will turn out much the opposite for you, as I affirm. There will be more who will refute you, whom I have now been holding back. You did not perceive them. And they will be harsher inasmuch as they are younger, and you will be more indignant. So he's saying, look, there are people that I've been holding back. And who would these sorts of people be? It's people like Euthyphro. Right? You see what Socrates does in the Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a person who is a loose cannon. Right? He claims to be wiser than everybody else, and he has all kinds of destructive and gloomy ideas that Socrates has exercised a moderating effect on him. That Socrates, many of the dialogues is seen exercising a moderating effect on people who would otherwise be extremely damaging and corrupting. There are certain intellectual or pseudo-intellectual types who are very harmful. And Socrates has been spending his time reining such people in. And without him around, they're going to be running loose. And they think that they've gotten rid of this gadfly, but actually he's been doing things that preserve them from far more insidious forms of philosophizing that are now going to have freer reign in his absence. And I think that's a very interesting point. Socrates' activity, in part, the mature Socrates' activity, in part, is precisely to limit or hold back the people who behave like the Socrates of the clowns did, corrupters of the youth. Of course, they don't know that because they don't see that happening. But if you look carefully at the interaction with Socrates and Euthyphro, you see that that's precisely what Socrates is trying to accomplish. He's reining in a corrupter, a father beater, rather than egging him on. And that's an unappreciated service that he's done to the city that they're not going to be able to benefit from anymore.